The cabin of the international flight was quiet and cool, filled with soft music, murmurs of conversation, and the occasional clink of a glass. It was a Moscow to Ouagadougou flight, business class nearly full, mostly company executives, consultants, and NGO staff heading to Burkina Faso. At seat 3A, a French businessman named Charles Dumont leaned back in his chair, scrolling through emails on his sleek tablet. Mid-40s, polished shoes, crisp suit, silver watch, and a permanent look of boredom. He was on his way to inspect a mining project his company had invested in. Nothing new, just another trip to the field. A few moments later, a man entered the cabin wearing simple trousers, a loose jacket, and sandals. He had no assistant, no briefcase, no designer anything, just a calm expression and dust still clinging to the edges of his clothes. That man was Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso. But no one in the cabin noticed. That's how Traoré liked to travel. Quiet, low-key, no titles, no attention. He nodded politely to the crew and passengers as he made his way to seat 3B, right beside Charles. Charles looked up once, gave a short nod, and returned to his screen. But the moment Traoré sat down and folded his jacket on his lap, Charles wrinkled his nose and looked again, longer this time. He noticed the sandals, the dry hands, the plain clothes. He leaned toward the flight attendant and whispered, "Excuse me, is there any chance I could change seats?" The attendant looked confused. "Is something wrong with your seat, sir?" Charles glanced at Traoré and muttered, "I just prefer to sit next to someone else." "No offense." The attendant raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry, sir. We're full in business class." Charles sighed heavily and sat back, clearly annoyed. "Unbelievable," he muttered in French. "You pay this much, and they seat you beside anyone." But what he didn't know, not yet, was that anyone was the head of the nation he was flying into. And by the time the plane landed, he would regret every word. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Charles Dumont grew visibly uncomfortable. He glanced at Ibrahim Traoré several times, frowning at his quiet, calm presence. Traoré didn't say much. He simply sat still, looking out the window, his hands resting lightly on his lap. Charles shifted in his seat, huffed dramatically, and began speaking loudly into his phone's notes app, pretending to record memos. "We'll need more control on the ground in Burkina Faso," he said aloud, making sure the man next to him could hear. "Locals are unpredictable. We need tighter contracts. They don't understand structure." He paused, glancing sideways. Traoré didn't react. Then Charles leaned toward the flight attendant again. "Still, no empty seats?" She shook her head politely. Charles forced a laugh. "I guess I'll have to survive next to the village chief," he said in French. Not knowing the passenger beside him understood every word. Another passenger across the aisle glanced over, eyebrows raised. Something felt off. Soon, dinner was served. Charles quickly took his tray and began to eat, not even offering a polite bon appetit. He asked for champagne and began to talk more, this time to the man on his left, across the aisle, a French engineer. "The people there," Charles said, gesturing subtly, "are simple-minded. You offer them a clinic, a water pump, they'll hand over land without thinking. But these new leaders, these ones like in Burkina Faso, they're dangerous. Too much pride, no business sense." The engineer didn't respond. He was too busy staring at the man Charles had just insulted. That man was quietly slicing his bread, still saying nothing, still just watching, still waiting. At one point, The attendant returned and offered Traoré a drink. He smiled softly and said, "Just water, please." His voice was warm, deep, a tone that carried authority without force. The French engineer across the aisle stiffened. He recognized the voice. He'd heard it on television before, in interviews, in speeches. His face turned pale. He leaned toward Charles and whispered something. Charles frowned. "What?" he asked. The man whispered again, more clearly this time. "That's President Ibrahim Traoré." Charles Dumont sat frozen, his eyes locked with the calm, unyielding gaze of President Ibrahim Traoré. The French engineer's whisper, "That's President Ibrahim Traoré," hung in the air like a death sentence. For a long, terrible moment, the cabin fell silent. The only sound was the hum of the plane's engines and Charles's shallow, panicked breaths. "Mr. President," Charles stammered in French, his voice cracking. I didn't know." Sweat glistened on his forehead as he replayed every arrogant word he had uttered. The insults about locals, the sneering village chief remark, the loud boasts about tightening contracts. Traoré tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged. "You didn't ask," the president replied softly, switching to flawless French. His tone carried neither anger nor mockery, just quiet finality. The flight attendant, now pale and trembling, rushed over. "Your Excellency, please forgive us. Had we known," Traoré raised a hand, cutting her off. "You treated me as you treat all passengers. That is enough." His eyes never left Charles, who shrank back into his seat, his earlier confidence crumbling. As the plane descended, Charles's mind raced. The mining deal, his company's biggest investment in West Africa, depended entirely on Burkina Faso's approval. Traoré's government had already expelled French troops and nationalized foreign-owned mines. Charles's arrogant comments, now overheard by half the cabin, could destroy everything. He leaned forward, desperation clawing at his throat. "Mr. President, if I said anything inappropriate, it was just business talk, nothing personal." Traoré turned sharply, his calm fracturing for the first time. "Everything is personal when you think power is yours to loan," he said, his voice low but piercing. "You borrow it, you don't own it." With that, he closed his eyes, ending the conversation. The remaining hours of the flight passed in suffocating silence. Charles stared at his untouched champagne, his tablet now dark. Across the aisle, passengers whispered and glanced at their phones. One recorded a discreet video of Charles's ashen face. When the pilot announced their descent into Ouagadougou, Traoré opened his eyes and straightened his jacket. Outside the window, the sun-baked tarmac came into view. But instead of taxiing to the terminal, the plane rolled to a stop near a waiting motorcade. Black SUVs flanked a red carpet. Soldiers stood at attention, and camera crews jostled for position. Charles watched in horror as Traoré stood. "Next time," the president said, adjusting his sleeve, "enter another man's country with respect, not above it." He stepped into the aisle, and the entire cabin erupted in muted gasps. A passenger near the front began clapping. Others followed. Traoré walked out into the blinding sunlight, greeted by saluting soldiers and cheering officials. Charles remained glued to his seat, staring at the empty space beside him. His phone buzzed. A flood of messages from colleagues. A news alert popped up. Breaking: video surfaces of French exec insulting Burkina Faso's president mid-flight. In the terminal, customs officers randomly selected Charles for a full baggage search. His company's permits? Under review. His hotel reservation cancelled. As he stood stranded at the airport, his assistant called. The board is furious. The deal suspended. They want you on the next flight home. Meanwhile, Traoré visited a rural school, shook hands with farmers, and launched a new hospital, all while trending globally. Hashtags like Respect Africa and Seat 3B flooded social media. By nightfall, murals of Traoré's plain seat appeared on Ouagadougou's walls. Charles's return flight felt infinitely longer. No business class this time. Economy, middle seat. As the plane took off, he stared at his reflection in the window. The Rolex, the tailored suit, the arrogance, all meaningless now. Somewhere below, a president in sandals kept working. Back in Burkina Faso, the story of Set 3B spread like wildfire. Street artists painted murals across Ouagadougou, one showing Traoré seated calmly beside a cowering man in a suite. The caption reading, "He asked to move seats. History moved him instead." Students debated the incident in classrooms. "He didn't shout or arrest the man," a teenager argued. "He just let the truth speak." Charles Dumont's company scrambled to contain the fallout. Press releases claimed miscommunication, but leaked airport footage showed Charles being denied entry to his luxury hotel, luggage searched 3 times. The mining deal, once a guaranteed $200 million profit, was suspended indefinitely. "All contracts under review," declared Burkina Faso's mining minister, a close ally of Traoré. The president himself never addressed the incident publicly. When reporters shouted questions about the Frenchman on the flight, Traoré simply smiled and said, "My seat was beside a man. What he saw beside him is his own problem." The quote trended globally, printed on t-shirts and protest signs from Lagos to Johannesburg. Meanwhile, Traoré continued his routine, visiting flood victims in the north, inaugurating solar farms, and meeting with small-scale miners. He still traveled without bodyguards, still wore sandals, still carried books about Sankara and Nkrumah. At a village school opening, an elder approached him. "Mr. President, you taught us something on that flight." "What did I teach?" Traoré asked. "That a lion doesn't need to roar," the old man replied. As months passed, Burkina Faso's policies shifted. Foreign mining companies faced stricter regulations. French troops completed their withdrawal. New partnerships emerged with Turkish engineers, Ghanaian tech firms, South African investors. Charles' company, once dominant, became a cautionary tale in boardrooms. Never underestimate the quiet man. One evening, Traoré worked late in his modest office. He opened a drawer and pulled out a creased boarding pass, seat 3B, Moscow to Ouagadougou. For a moment, he studied it, then placed it back without ceremony. There were no trophies here, no framed headlines about the viral flight. Just maps of pending projects, reports on education reforms, and a faded photo of Thomas Sankara. The next morning, Traoré boarded another flight, this time to a rural clinic. No motorcade, no press. A young boy stared at his sandals. "Are you really the president?" Traoré knelt, eye level with the child. "I'm a man who works for Burkina Faso, that's all." As the plane taxied, a European journalist whispered to her cameraman, "That's him, the president who travels like a peasant." "No," the cameraman corrected. "The peasant who became president."